Great.
Fantastic. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining today's psychology taster session with Montfort University in Leicester. We're going to be exploring why does my brain glitch with Caitlin from the university today. Throughout today's session, there'll be lots of opportunities for you to engage and interact and ask questions. We do have the Q&A function turned on for you. So throughout today, if you do have questions that you'd like to ask, then please do pop them into that Q&A. I'll be keeping an eye on them along with Vanessa from the university, and then we'll leave a nice 10 minutes at the end to go through and answer as many of those questions as we can. But I can see numbers from the waiting room are starting to settle out, so I won't take up any more of your time today, and I'll hand over to Caitlin for today's psychology taster. Over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So, hello everyone. I'm Dr. Caitlin Zavaleta, and today we'll be talking about brain glitches, which, in my opinion, is loads of fun to discuss. So, let's get into it. Now, a brief warning: my voice is a little bit off, so if I have to take a pause, I will. But we'll jump right back in. All right. So, the abstract for the talk in general, we're talking about why our brains glitch, right? So, we want to understand those questions of like, why are we forgetting names? Why are we mixing up words? Why are we switching languages without meaning to? These are all fantastic examples of things that we study in psychology. So, while this is very language related, language is one of those behaviors in cognition that we study in the field of psychology. And this is the area of my research. So, first, I'll introduce myself a little bit more, talk about my research background, just so you can see what I teach and what I research and how those two interact and what your lecturers will likely be doing. Then we'll discuss these errors. We'll discuss how the mind is organized. And then we're going to discuss what happens when things go right and when things go wrong. And we're going to then bring it round and say, what does this mean for bilinguals or multilinguals? So, to begin, my name is Dr. Caitlin Zavaleta. I'm a senior lecturer in psychology at Montfort University. I would describe myself as a psycholinguist, which is the best term that you could have as a linguist. And what that means is that my research is at the intersection of psychology and linguistics. So, I'm really interested in science. My focus is the scientific study of language, but in particular, I'm interested in how that applies to human behavior. So I want to understand how we go about speaking, how we go about switching languages, and honestly, my favorite thing to study is what happens when things go wrong. So that's the focus of today's talk. All of those errors. I promise they are normal, they are fantastic, they're really interesting to study, and we're going to understand a lot more about those today. So, my area of research is on multilingualism, on speech production, and we're going to talk about that versus speech comprehension, and then how we switch different languages and the beauty of having all these different languages to study. My research or my teaching that I study is I do research methods. So, I'm really interested in how we go about designing a research study. So, one of the modules that I teach on is the third year dissertation module. And this is when you get to be that first time researcher for yourself and you design a research study and you create it and you get to collect the data from it. And then at the end, you can say you have done a full research study from beginning to end. I love teaching that module. It's a lot of fun to study how students get to get over those first scary moments of actually doing their own research, but see all of those rewards afterwards. And then I also teach in cognitive psychology. So, again, all the mind and brain stuff. Now, one of the things that I love to do, because I love to teach and I love to tell people about the exciting, interesting, and really nerdy things about how we learn and produce language, is I have a podcast. So some of our research is produced in this scholarly podcast where we say, okay, this is what we learn about in the research studies, in those really dense research studies that you read about in journals. How can we make that a lot more accessible? So my hope is that today's talk is not too dense and that you do enjoy yourself as we go. So let's begin. All right, the focus of the talk today is on errors. So these are those little mistakes that our brains make. One of these errors is forgetting a name. Another might be calling someone by the wrong name or forgetting a word that you do know, not something that you just don't know, using the wrong word than the one that you meant to use, and then switching languages. So all of these errors are explained by the way our mind is organized. So to better understand why and how we make these errors, we need to go back to that. The first thing we need to think about is how the mind is organized. So, I want you to think about what you understand about the mind versus the brain. Now, there are two different things here. One, we are discussing the brain as that organic matter that sits in your skull and has electrical activity and connections and structures and all of that. That is the physical brain. Cognitive psychology, while we do interact with the brain and we want to understand where different things are located or different processes occur and connections happen in the brain, we're really interested in the thing we can't see, the thing we cannot pinpoint, and that's your mind. So your mind is that representation of ideas. Okay? So your mind holds all of this information that you memorize. So it's how you organize maybe groups of words that you might have memorized for school. It might be how you are remembering how to get to the shops. It might be remembering that, oh, right, I have an assessment due on Friday. These kinds of information are what we store in the mind, not necessarily the brain. There's not like a neuron that is for your assessment. We would nurture it if we could. So let's think about how the mind might be organized. Close your eyes for a second and have a think. How do you think of your mind organized? So you might think of it as this very well organized set of shelves with binders and folders, and everything is super well organized, and you've got it all set up there, and that is beautiful. You might conceptualize it as, yes, still a bookshelf, but perhaps a little bit messier. I feel like that's how I would say mine is this week. Maybe your mind, in the way you think about it, is more of a table with things strewn about, connections, ideas, but it's kind of a mess, but you know the mess. You can get there. Or maybe you think about it as a web, as a spider web. So we have different connections and we're coming from different directions. And when we make multiple paths, it's perhaps thicker. In psychology, we want to understand how the mind is organized. There's a little bit of truth to each of these different ideas of how we represent the mind. Perhaps the closest, I think, would have to be the spider web idea. But that doesn't discount these other ideas as well. We can even go back to Sherlock Holmes and Arthur Conan Doyle and think about the mind as how things are organized and how things are jumbled up. So I love this quote because it says that a person's brain is like their empty attic, and you have to stock it with the furniture that you choose. And that's really a helpful quote because when we learn things, what happens is we take the information from the world around us, all of that stimuli, whether that is sound based, whether that is tactile, whether it's a smell like sensory information from your nose, a taste, and we take that information and we process it through our attentional filters. And then it goes into our memory. And it's a lot like perhaps some Pixar movies that you may have seen, where you are going into the mind and you're thinking about how things are organized. And it's actually really closely related. So, what happens is you take all that information around you, you put it through your attentional capacities, you then bring that into your memory. And it's important to understand where we then go and store that memory. The way it is stored in your mind is that we store concepts. And we think about a concept as like an idea, and that's pretty simple and easy. But these concepts are linked to our language store, which is what we call our lexicon. And that lexicon is essentially a giant dictionary of all of the words that you speak. Now, we don't yet know, or we haven't quite agreed on whether there's one lexicon for even a multilingual speaker, or if there are multiple lexicons, like a French lexicon and a Spanish lexicon and an English lexicon. We do know that for a monolingual English speaker in North America, they have about 20,000 to 30,000 items in their lexicon. So I hope that is feeling like a fantastic praise for you on a Monday evening where you have all of these different items already sat into your lexicon. So these lexicon have lexical units, and each lexical unit has a lot of information to it. It has your conceptual information, so the idea, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. It has grammatical information, information about pronunciation, information about how it's written, so the actual spelling perhaps. It has acoustic information. And when we access that concept in our mind, we are accessing similar ideas because we store them either close to each other or we have a faster path to get to and from these two concepts. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment. But as we are choosing a word to say, and this is going to come up a few times in the talk today, as we are choosing a word to say, we are dealing with two mental processes that I want you to keep in mind. These mental processes are activation and inhibition. And we're using both of these, both activation and inhibition, in order to select a lexical item, which is connected to the concept. So let's see this in a better example here. So, how is the mind organized? Like this. So, if the concept here is a cat, we've got a mental image of what a cat looks like. You might have a bit of information about, well, it's friend shaped. So, I'm a cat person. You're going to see loads of cats through this presentation. We've got information about being a four-legged, pointy-eared, furry creature with a tail. It purrs, snuggles up, loves a warm blanket, all of these pieces of information. And that's my concept of a cat. If you're not a cat person, you may have different pieces of information. And that's part of your lexicon, your idiolect. So with the concept of a cat, we have that grammatical information. We discussed that on the last slide. So information about the fact that it is a noun, so cat, although in English we can do silly things with nouns, we can verbify them. You know that to pluralize it, you have to add an S, so cats. We know that we have pronunciation and we have different words. And here's where things change up a little bit on whether we agree or disagree on how different languages are organized. But we have different words we can use. So you can see, you can have this concept of the furry creature that lives in your home, and you can call him cat, or you can call it a kitten, or you could call it a feline. Those aren't wrong terms either, but you have to decide what nuance of meaning you want to communicate. So is it kitten? This was a picture of my 18-year-old cat, and she was a kitten, a baby her entire life. And that's what I called her. Technically, no, but that's how I referred to her. So you have to keep in mind that these things do change really quickly and really specifically to the individual. Now, other information that might be included might be just knowing that in Spanish, cat is gato, or it's chat in French. All of this information you want to have looped in when you think about how the mind is organized. So that's in the concept, okay? So we've got cat, and we're going to have the concept of a cat related to things that make sense with it. So we're going to talk about this in two different ways. We're going to discuss semantic neighbors and we're going to discuss phonological neighbors. So what are things that are related by meaning to a cat? Have a think. So the word cat, we've got kitten. We already have that example. It's related, right? It's like cat, but it has a slightly different meaning. Typically refers to a smaller version, like the youth version of a cat, or you might be using it in a different nuance where every cat is kitten. What is another thing that's semantically related to the word cat? Maybe you've come up with the word dog. It's another pet that lives in a home. You might come up with the word feline. We saw that on the last slide. So yes, it is a feline, but it's a different meaning if you were to say, like, the feline needs to be fed. We have rules in language about what's an appropriate term and what's an appropriate level of description. So you likely wouldn't select feline, but it is related. You might just think of the word pet. That's a related concept. Or a bird. Now, what I've done on the slide is I've had a thicker line to kitten because it's more closely related to cat. Then came dog. I'm not sure if that did come through in the slide very well, but we also have that concept of dog, and those things are related. So the reason those lines are a little bit thicker is because we know through research that things that are semantically related are more likely to access other things. And what I mean by that is I'm discussing the idea of priming. So it's like when you are walking down a path. You could walk through a forest where there's nobody there, it's completely uninhabited, dense forestry, dense trees and bushes and things like that. And it's harder to walk through that, right? But think about maybe the field that's near your home. Pretty open space. Maybe a lot of people take the same footpath. and it's fairly worn down. So it's faster for you, even if the distance were the same, to access that frequently trod path as opposed to the one that's in a dense forest. And that's how priming works. Things that are related, either by concept or by spelling or sound, are make it easier to access other things. So it's kind of like if you were going into your bookshelf and you have your books all organized by genre. So if you were to grab Outlander, for example, and you're thinking, oh, yeah, you know what's another great book? And then you find another time travel book. It's faster to get to it because they're organized similarly. Another example is using phonological or orthographic neighbors. So here's where I really want you to dig down deep and think about things that rhyme with cat. So try to think about all the words you can think of. Takes you back to a little bit of Dr. Seuss. So we've got cat, hat, mat, bat, that, all of these rhymes because we're already priming the phonological information for that word. And then we can go down this other path of the words that are related. Again, we're already looking on that shelf, so it's faster to access. Now, with language processing, we tend to have two different processes we think of. Now, I already said activation and inhibition, and yes, but those happen for both of these. Here, we're discussing language production and language comprehension. Now, I know you have all at least done some sort of a foreign language, whether that was in primary or whether that was just today in class. You've done some sort of learning of a word from another language. And in this, you are probably comfortable saying that you can understand more than you can speak. I know that's certainly the case for me. And what I think about is interesting about that is that when we produce a language, there's so much going on that we have to really dig down deep, focus on the information, access it, and bring it to the front to be able to produce it. And then we have to get over that anxiety that maybe we're not producing it right. So there are more processes that are involved. So let's break that down a little bit. What happens when you're hearing a word? Well, when you are just hearing a word, so we're talking about language comprehension here, you are perceiving that auditory stimulus, whether it's auditory, if you're hearing it, or written, if you're perceiving language comprehension, it's been written down. And we are activating that sound, which then activates your mental representation, your concept. So that mental representation activates the concept, and then we understand cat means cat, the thing that purrs and walks around my house. When you choose to say a word, though, it seems like it's just as simple, but it's not necessarily in practice. When you are choosing to say this word, you have to think of the concept that you want to say, the thing that's walking around my house, that's purring and yelling for food. And we are activating that concept. And that concept is before the word, it's just the idea. So think about what just the idea of a cat is. And then you have to formulate the plan. So you figured out what the word is because you've activated that concept. But then what we have to do is we have to choose how to, choose how to say it. So what happens is that we have to formulate that linguistic plan. So we are saying, okay, I know what the thing is. I'm going to call it by its name. It's the thing that walks around and asks for food, yells at me sometimes. Okay, so what is it called? So I choose the concept. Hopefully, I've selected the right thing. And then I go into my lexical information. I say, this is the thing I want to say. And then I bring that information to my Broca's area, which is how we process the planning of language. So Broca's area then sends information to your motor system. And your motor system says, right, this is how we're going to say that word. And then we start to produce it. And when we're producing it, we're not necessarily producing it in isolation. We produce the word usually in a sentence, usually in a phrase, something like that. And we share that information and hopefully we pronounce it right. And then we monitor. So we say, okay, did I make a mistake? Did I say that right? For me, so I come from the Chicagoland area in the US originally. I say cat, usually I say cat. It's like a cat is a very spread vowel, and that's the way I produce it. But if I'm in work mode, I have a longer cat, and that vowel is very different. So it's cat instead of cat, if you can hear that difference. So I'm choosing to integrate that information based on where I am into how I'm then producing the word. And it's not just something that you choose to do. A good example of this is when you say the word don't and you follow it up with the word you. And you usually say something more like don't you. Now, this is a Teams call or an online call. So you are safe to say don't you in the privacy of wherever you are. And you can say that and you're not going to feel silly. So I'd like you to try doing that. Say don't you versus don't you. And there's a difference you can feel in the way that your mouth is organizing itself and the way we're planning through that. And that's how we do language. That's how we speak. That's how we produce. So we've got a lot of things that are happening. And maybe that's why speech production can be really so difficult. So that's what happens when it all goes right. Fantastic. Easy peasy. The problem is we make mistakes. They're not all the time. We're not constantly making mistakes, but we do make mistakes frequently enough. And it's studying speech errors that tell us about how everything is organized. Think about it this way. If you opened up a packet of biscuits and it's a packet of biscuits where there's perhaps some frosting on it and then sprinkles on top. So like a plain biscuit, frosting and sprinkles. If you were to look at the biscuit, sorry, and you were to see that there were no sprinkles on top, you would know that there was something wrong with the sprinkle machine, right? That would tell you at what point in the production process something stopped working. Or maybe there were biscuits and they were flipped rather than being in the right direction. So maybe it's upside down. Maybe the Oreo stamp is on the inside instead of the outside. So it tells you about what happened and what went wrong. When we study this with language, this tells us what has gone wrong a lot clearer than if it all went right. If it all went right, it wouldn't tell us about the order. Now, I promised you I was going to give you answers as to why these are all happening. So let's go it problem by problem. Remember, there are a few things that you are paying attention to. Activation of concepts, the fact that concepts have a lot of information related to them, and that we activate one and it activates others, and things that are related are more likely to be switched out. So let's look at the examples that we have here. So the first example is forgetting a name. Dun, dun, dun. So what's happening here? Okay, let's say you are in the situation where you meet someone new. You say, okay, what was her name? I think we've all been there, unless you were fantastic with names. If you are, rock on. So we've got this new person. Oh, darn it, what was her name? It started with an A. You might have other information like, oh, she's from Leicester, which doesn't help you get her name, but it started with an A, she's from Leicester. Yikes. So how do I get to her name? I don't remember what her name was. It could be different options. Maybe you start generating ideas. Was it Alice? Was it Agatha? Was it Amelia? Probably Amelia. There's a lot of Amelias. It'd be a fair guess. You might remember how long the name was, how many syllables it was, and you're accessing some of that information. But the problem is that this information wasn't very clearly encoded the first time. When we take information about the world around us, it is more solidly remembered and saved and encoded when it has different information tacked onto it, right? So we've got the idea of concepts. If that concept sits all by itself and you don't know anything else about it, it's not going to help you because you can't get to it in a different way. So when you're studying, when you're revising, when you have different connections to different ideas, you do better because you have those other paths to get to that information. It's connecting to other things that you know. So if we remembered that the name started with an A and it ended with an A, okay, that narrows down our options. It was Amelia, 3 syllables. We still might have Agatha to contend with, but maybe you remember, oh, but it's a younger name. So you've got that information. So this is how we might access that. So we have to take a different path, essentially. Anything that, or if we're forgetting something that we knew, we just lost our path. What's another example? Calling someone by the wrong name. If you have siblings or cousins, perhaps, and anytime you've been called by the wrong name, it happens a lot. We do it. I know we do it. There are two different situations that might be happening. The first is if there is a phonological similarity. So names that look or sound the same. And the second is if they have a meaning that's similar. Remember, concepts have all of these different kind of tags where they tack on information. So let's say that there's something that's not been knocked over on the table, like a water glass. And I want to say, by the name of the creature that did this. So the creature that knocks things over. Well, maybe it is the dog's name that is often knocking things over, or maybe it's the child's name who is knocking things over. It could go either way, right? So with that information, what is happening here? We've got semantic similarity that's playing a role, and this semantic similarity is saying, we need the name of the creature that knocks things over, and maybe the dog, maybe the cat, maybe whatever creatures live in your house that tend to knock things over, that is the thing. And you say, oh, right. And if you have multiple options, you choose one and maybe it doesn't work out right. So that's one way we might have the wrong name being called. Also, very similar if there's a teacher and they've had your older sibling. They say, oh, right, that kid, their name is, insert your sibling's name there. Another example, phonological similarity, starts with a K sound. If the name is Caitlin versus Catherine, very similar names. My sister's name is very similar to mine. The number of times we have been mixed up happens a lot. So this kind of information might be both semantically related and phonologically related. But what's happening here in your concept is you're essentially saying, oh, it could be this, and it could be this. And we're tagging all of that information. And then we have to choose between all of these activated concepts. So remember, that idea is coming back again, the idea of activation, and hopefully we could do a little better inhibiting. Another example, forgetting a word that you know. Now, this is called tip of the tongue. This is a word that you actually know. Usually, it's something that we know the word, but we can't say it. This happened to me the other day, and I still have not resolved this tip of the tongue state. It's when you have something, and this is not an American phrase, it's a British phrase, where it's something that's made for the situation. I'm so close to remembering what that word is. But it's when you need something for the specific situation. It's not de facto, but it's another phrase like that. But that's all the information I can get to. That's it. I know the word, I've used the word, I'm familiar enough with it to know what it is and how to use it and all that, but I can't access it. Why? Well, it could be because I'm activating wrong information or by chance I'm inhibiting it. So remember, we had those two processes. We have activation of concepts, and it has its evil twin here, inhibition. And inhibition means that we're going to kind of dampen it down, like we're ignoring it. It's when you're focusing on something and you're ignoring something else. Inhibiting. You're saying, nope, I'm not going to say it. You are trying really hard not to perhaps swear. And you're saying, nope, I'm going to inhibit that. I'm not going to say that. Oh, sugarfoot is what you might say instead. So we have activation and inhibition. They work together. They work very similarly. So tip of the tongue is happening, according to some researchers, because we are trying to activate it, but instead we've inhibited it. So it's kind of like that light switch is turned off. A good example of trying to induce tip of the tongue is if I were to ask you, what is the name of the object that is a navigational instrument and it's used for measuring distances, especially like the altitude of sun, moon, and stars at sea? What is the name? So, tip of the tongue happens to everyone. It does happen more when we are tired or when we're stressed It happens more to older individuals, and it also happens more to bilingual people. So the target word you might have been looking for is the sextant, which is when people try to come up with that word, they come up with things that are either semantically related or a phonological similar, like it's almost the word, but it's not quite. So what happens when we use the wrong word? Okay, we went into our mind. We said, I want to use this, right? The name for this thing that holds my hot tea. What is it called? I want to say, oh, this is my favorite blank name of object. So what's happening? Well, sometimes we make errors. We just make speech errors. Sometimes it means that we are going into the mind and we are activating the wrong thing or activating multiple selections and they just kind of blend together. So sometimes it's an implementation fail where it's actually your motor control where you start to say like "Ugh," those kinds of speech errors where you do catch yourself. Remember that's part of the production process, but it's a motor fail essentially. We've got four generalizations about speech errors. In general, it's about either activation or production, incorrect production of the utterance. It might just be blending words. So there's a good example in Mean Girls where she says great. She blends those two words, right? Great and cool. And she says gruel. It's obviously embarrassing, but it's a beautiful speech error. Another example is that when we are producing words and we select the wrong one and we mix them up and we put them in the wrong part of the sentence, we do still have the right emphasis, which means that emphasis is coming before the word. So things like saying, cat, it's too hungry for you to be early, rather than cat, it's too early for you to be hungry. Same emphasis, the word is in the wrong spot. So that tells us that the emphasis and that pattern of your sentence that you're using exists before you add the word, right? We're going back to that idea of understanding how the biscuits are made. Biscuit, frosting, sprinkles. Here, it's not sprinkles first, because otherwise we wouldn't have the error. We wouldn't even get through to the sentence and we wouldn't have that emphasis. So, speech errors tell us a lot about what happens when things go right by looking at what happens when it goes wrong. Now, that last example of a speech error is a language switch. And these are my particular favorite because this is my research. Language switching means that we are trying to say a word in one language and we say it in a different language. Usually you do this on purpose. So you might switch to a different language when you forget the word or when it would just be easier to switch to a different language or when the people in the room are different and they don't speak that language. So you want to be inclusive. So you switch languages there. But sometimes we have a thing happen where we are trying to say a word in one language and it ends up in another. So for me, English is my native language. I also speak French to a very high fluency and I understand a fair bit of Spanish. I was speaking to someone and I wanted to say, like, oh, yeah, things are going all right. This is someone who I usually speak French with. So I wanted to say, comme ci, comme ça, but instead I said, así, así, which means the same thing, but it's not the right words. It's not the right language that I wanted. So what does that tell us? It tells us again about the order. So at what point are we selecting the language? At what point are we selecting the word itself? So these are interesting questions. It also means that we're dealing with another situation where we're saying, okay, but like you had English too. Why didn't you just say, so so? Instead of not being able to say it in French, why switch to Spanish instead of English? Presumably my English is better. So why? These are unintentional switches. And unfortunately, this is an area of research that's understudied, but it's something that happens frequently enough. Just like when you go on holiday and you are trying to say to the person at the shop, you mean to say thank you, but instead you say gracias. It's not the language that you wanted in France. It's not going to help you so much, but that's what came out. So part of my research examines what happens and why, and what's the role of proficiency or just kind of like your default second language. So this is the types of questions that I ask, and these are the types of questions that my undergraduate research assistants help me examine in more detail. Now, thinking back to those ideas of activation and inhibition. So remember, we are selecting a word that we want to say, and we are inhibiting the other words. Now, if you are a bilingual speaker, even if that was a good error, even if you speak it just a little bit, you might have some advantages. So you are choosing to activate one word, which means that you are practicing inhibiting other words. It might go in a different direction where you're trying to speak in your second language and you have to inhibit these other languages. So by studying all these different languages, we can understand more about these cognitive patterns. And we might ignore this question that assumes that bilingualism is either monolingual or bilingual, fully fluent, and realize that in fact we're a little all over and it changes a lot. Now there are loads of advantages to studying bilingual or to examining bilingualism and encouraging your own language learning. There are benefits for metacognitive not metacognitive skills and even your ability to um, just have a better aging process. So that's one of the newer studies that's come through. There are disadvantages, though. There are some specific issues that may happen, like your pronunciation may be a little bit different than an actual native monolingual speaker. But what we've discussed is the errors that we encounter, the way the mind is organized, how things go right, how they go wrong, and what does this mean for multilinguals. So, what I want to really articulate is that errors happen and that they tell us some really interesting things about the mind that we wouldn't know about otherwise. Bilingualism and multilingualism allows for cognitive benefits, and language learning is a critical skill you should be encouraging. So, thank you for listening. This is what you would encounter if you were one of our students in our cognitive psychology module. So, I hope that you enjoyed it. I'm happy to take any questions if you have them.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Caitlin. I know I'm definitely guilty of lots of the bits that we've covered today, and they happen quite regularly, and you're never too sure why. And I've quite often been called my brother's name as well, so that
Yep.
applies also. Students have got lots of questions around what we've covered today, but also some slightly adjacent, which have come through first. So one of the questions is similar to today. How can we explain, and we've probably only got a couple of minutes to do this, deja vu? Is that similar in terms of how that
Ooh,
works in the brain?
it is. That's a really good connection. Kudos. It basically means that you are accessing the similar situation and you're activating it, and you're like, ooh, that feels familiar because this is something that I've done or encountered before, and you're just activating it.
Right, okay, so yes, very similar pathway, I suppose, in the brain that things are taken. One student asked, and I know you hear stories of this, I don't know, yeah, what evidence is out there, but how do some people wake up from a coma speaking a different language?
Oh, so usually that's if they sound like they're speaking a different language.
Right, okay.
They have to have already known it. But there are people who will be a bilingual speaker, use their second language for their whole adult life, and then have to like relearn that first language, or they only speak that first language again. And there are different patterns, and those that's called aphasia. And that's a really interesting way to understand how the brain is organized.
Right, really interesting. Maybe an area that that student might want to go off and explore more and find out
Yeah,
more
absolutely.
about. 'Cause yeah, you do hear stories of it, don't you?
Hmm.
Maddie would like to know, are there any good books to read around this topic?
Oh yeah, loads. In the last few years, there's been some really interesting ones for the general press. Um, what's her name? Her last name is Marion. It's Viorica Marion, and she just posted or published a general press book about bilingualism, and it talks about all the different research that she's done, and she's done a lot of really interesting stuff. That would be a good person, and I can put that information out if you want to share that as well. And then Albert Costa also has a good one, and Francois Grosjean. All of those researchers generally, if you look at anywhere on bilingual brain or bilingual mind, multilingualism, you'll find loads. There's a lot of really good options.
Amazing. Yeah, and I think we saw there as well the pathway of landing on the first name first and then finding your way
Yeah,
to the next
exactly.
name. So yeah, getting to see the lecture in action as well.
Yeah.
We'll see it day to day. One student has asked, why do we sometimes feel embarrassed about this when it's happening? And then can that embarrassment lead to even more of a delay in landing on the right name or the right information?
It does, because when we're stressed, like, we have more tip of the tongue, and then you're like, "Oh, what is this?" And then you feel so silly that you call this your ankle, for example, instead of your elbow, and they're like, "Well, I know what it is," and then you feel silly and you feel bad about yourself, but it's normal, and I think I could say literally everyone does it.
Yeah, and I think Karina's asked as well, is there anything that we can do to reduce the frequency of this happening? Are there daily habits that we can pick up, brain training exercises that we can do? And does this get worse perhaps as we get older?
It does get worse as we get older. I would say generally the best thing that you can do is to practice retrieving information. So it's not necessarily just reading, it's thinking about things and coming up with your own ideas about how things work. Because in that case, you're having to go retrieve that information and generate your different ideas and how they're organized and all of that. That's going to be the best way to have a healthy brain. Multilingualism, bilingualism are also really good at developing that activation and inhibition. We might see a little more tip of the tongue, but there's a lot of research that suggests that you've got more cognitive advantages.
Fantastic. Great. And some top tips for students to go away and
Mhm.
practice all of those different brain games and see. I'm sure we'll all notice the next time that it happens to us and we're trying to fill in
Oh,
those
yeah.
blanks or find those words and names, and they'll think back to this session as well. Lucy is saying that they are thinking about exploring psychology at university, and this session has confirmed for them that it's definitely something they find really interesting. But what
Great.
does psychology look like as a university degree? What options are there, I suppose, module wise to choose from? What does the study look like for a university student?
That's a great question. So there's a lot on our website. So I'm at De Montfort University, and you can look, just Google us, and you'll find all of our courses and all of that information. But in general, psychology is a really strong program to study because you are developing quantitative research method skills. So, like all the numbers and all the stats, you're discussing research and how it's organized and how it's designed, how to answer these in depth questions about any data that you're going to have, and that's something that's really crucial for the future. So our students take research methods classes. They learn, like I said, quantitative number skills, qualitative skills, so interviewing skills, focus groups, and any ability to lead a discussion amongst other individuals, whether you're actually collecting data or you're just out in the real world interacting with people. It's a strong skill to have. There's other things like our students will do things, they'll one of our modules has a podcast that they do. We talk about social issues and how they relate to psychology, and they do a podcast as their assessment. Other things where we do those labs, we do biopsych labs, cog psych labs. Those are the ones I tend to enjoy doing. We get them in, and we get to do some of the cool thing. So, like, we get to do a skin conductance test, like a polygraph and things like that, and to see if actually being a participant and kind of playing with it a little bit, what that tells us and how that aligns to the general pattern.
Fantastic. So lots of different ways of learning, I think, with psychology, and
Yes.
not just all
Yeah,
academic, lots
absolutely.
of hands-on, practical experiments that students can be getting involved with too. There are lots of different questions coming in relation to the session topic, which I think we could do a whole additional 45 minutes on delving into all of that information that we found out. But I think the last question that we'll have a chance to run through today is Anita would like to know, what are some of the career pathways after studying something like cognitive psychology?
That's a good question. So, after you study cognitive psychology, you've got a lot of those quantitative research method skills. You could do something like data science, user manage or user experience, that kind of research, because you understand how the research works and how to ask these really clever, pointed questions so that the people who pay the big bucks can get those questions answered. And you're able to then interpret that information at different levels. So, like, you can do a research report, right, which is the standard academic report, and that's helpful in the workplace. But other things like being able to describe it to someone in a more casual manner and take these really in-depth
Mm.
theories and ideas and interpret them in different ways. That's also something that we do. It's a lot of translation, honestly. But to know what the person I'm talking to needs to know, which is what you're doing with research, right? And to be able to take that information, practice retrieving it, and then share it with someone else in a different way. So there's a lot of that. You can do just about anything. I think interacting with people, interacting with numbers, so less people, but more numbers, and understanding that dense science. It's certainly a skill that you're going to have in the future, especially as we're trying to navigate what AI means and how to interpret that information in front of us.
Fantastic. Yeah, that was another question that popped up as well about how AI is impacting our ability to recall information when we've got so much at our
Oh my
fingertips.
gosh, I'd
Our brains
love
are
to
getting a
chat
bit
more.
lazy. But again, yeah, probably
Yeah.
a whole other 45-minute session where we could explore that. We are sort of out of time for today, but I do just want to say a huge thank you to all of the students. There are some, it really shows how engaged they've been with the types of questions that they've been asking in the Q&A. I can see that they've really enjoyed today's session. We will be sharing the recording of today with you by email tomorrow if you wanted to re-watch any bits or catch anything that you've missed, alongside lots of links where you can continue to explore the courses on offer at De Montfort University, find out more about what it's like to study there, or perhaps book on to an open day in the new year too. This is a very short taster of everything that the university has got to offer, but hopefully it's piqued your interest to continue to explore after today. And I also want to say a huge thank you as well to you, Caitlin, for what has been, yeah, an incredibly interesting and engaging session. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank
Your
you.
voice made it through as well. Hopefully
It
you'll
made it
be
through.
a little bit better soon too. And hopefully we'll see you on another Unifrog event in the future. Thank you so much. And I hope everybody has a lovely evening.
Thanks, everyone.